Welcome everyone to the Canadian Sociological Association's webinar, Reprioritizing Pedagogic Feedback, Faculty Experiences with Qualitative Comments from Student Evaluations of Teaching, otherwise known as SETS. We invite you to communicate with the panelists today during the webinar. Please note that your chats will only be visible to panelists, so we encourage you to utilize the Q&A function to submit your questions. You may choose to upvote questions you feel should have priority over others. I'm sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once today. So there you go. There are the instructions to help you chat with the panelists or submit your questions during today's webinar. I'd now like to introduce you to our moderator for today, Dr. Rochelle Côté from Memorial University. Dr. Côté is the current chair of the Canadian Sociological Association Policy, Ethics, and Professional Concerns Subcommittee, and will be discussing the highlights of the report with Dr. Kowalchuk, as well as facilitating engagement with the audience. Rochelle, I now turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon, everyone, from sunny and warm St. John's on the east coast of Canada today. And welcome to the CSA webinar series, where we'll be talking about the foundational report being released by the association that looks at the faculty experiences with qualitative comments on student evaluations of teaching. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous nations on whose lands we are meeting today, from wherever it is that we're participating on this vast territory, and to thank them for the opportunity to present our thoughts here. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders of these lands, both past and present. Our guest speaker today is going to be Dr. Lisa Kowalchuk, Professor of Sociology at the University of Guelph. And she spearheaded this project when she was in my role as chair of the CSA Policy, Ethics, and Professional Concerns Subcommittee. I'd also like to give a quick nod to Dr. Kowalchuk's collaborators, Dr. Rachel Latouche, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto, and PhD candidate Rochelle Wajasinga at McMaster University. And I think it's fair to say that both of these smart women were instrumental in seeing this research and report through to completion. I don't think Dr. Kowalchuk would argue with me on that at all. And with that, I think we're going to get started, and I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Kowalchuk to get started on this important piece of research.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, and thank you, Sherry. Hello, everyone. To all who are joining this event live and those who will view it later on, thanks for your attention to the topic. And I'm really honored and pleased to be part of the CSA webinar series. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I will be presenting highlights of a study co-authored by Rachel Latouche, Rochelle Wajasinga, and myself on faculty experiences with qualitative comments and SETS. Now, some of you will have read the full report, which was made available on the CSA website a few weeks ago. But whether you have or not, the presentation is intended to set the stage for some productive discussion of our results and the implications of that. My two co-researchers, Rachel and Rochelle, could not join us due to work commitments, and they each have very important fortes that made the study possible. So I'll do my best to reflect what I learned from them in working on the project. What I'm going to talk about today is why and how we did this study, the main highlights of it, both the quantitative and qualitative findings, and thirdly, what my co-authors and I think should be done in light of the findings and in light of related scholarship. So what was the impetus for a cross-Canada study focusing specifically on the open-ended feedback component of SETS? Well, there's two main motivators of the study, and the first has to do with a relative silence in the literature about SETS. We knew that the recent scholarship was making an increasingly compelling indictment of the numerical scores part of the SETS surveys, partly on the grounds of their validity as a metric for summative evaluation of teaching. For those who may be less familiar with the terminology, summative refers to the use of SETS results to determine one's overall teaching performance and to rank it relative to one's colleagues. And there's been a growing reliance on those scores from SETS for that purpose, by universities throughout North America and much of the Western world since the 1970s. So it was increasingly clear that set scores are a vastly inadequate indicator. Some have called them a pseudo-indicator of teaching quality. And just as disturbingly, the latest studies were also showing quite definitively that set scores are biased against faculty who belong to equity-seeking groups. They essentially become a source of occupational discrimination against already disadvantaged groups when they're used to determine promotion and renewal and hiring and performance ranking. And testament to how impactful and definitive those recent studies have been was the 2018 resolution of a grievance brought by the Ryerson University Faculty Association against Ryerson University over the use of sets. And the arbitrator ruled that sets scores should no longer be used for tenure and promotion decisions at that university. But we know that sets surveys typically also include a set of open-ended questions for comments on courses and teaching. And yet until very recently, there was very little research into what was going on in the content of these qualitative comments and how they affect those receiving end. Even the Ryerson ruling doesn't really talk about the comments or what should be done to improve how they're obtained and used. Now, the comments in sets may seem to count less in the summative appraisal of faculty, but the fact is they do get taken into account by evaluating committees, and professors are expected to engage with them to improve their teaching. Now, professors tend not to talk very much with each other about comments that are degrading or mean-spirited, just out of a sense of shame and embarrassment. But nevertheless, we could see more and more anecdotal essays being published, observing that unfair and hostile and even harassing comments were creeping more and more into sets. So given the unequivocal finding that set scores are biased, to us this meant that the content of the comments may also be treating equity-seeking groups worse than others, and that would potentially mean an uneven burden in terms of faculty mental health and well-being and professional self-esteem. But having said that, though, it's not acceptable that anyone would be subject to harassing and hostile comments in their evaluations. And this problem, if it exists, would mean that there's also uneven penalties and rewards flowing to faculty when their sets comments are being examined by committees. So that was the first main impetus. The second impetus for the study has to do with how well or how poorly the comments of sets are serving our pedagogy and by extension our students' learning. A word to the undergraduate students who are viewing this and engaging with the study: we believe that you can only benefit from some long overdue improvements to the way your qualitative feedback on university teaching is obtained and how it's processed. And that's because the system that's been in place for several decades, for sets in general and for the commentary component in particular, really undermines the quality of teaching in so many ways. So devising ways to get more meaningful feedback that includes constructive criticism will open the door to greater improvements in pedagogy. And we think that students who learn how to provide good faith feedback, both on the strengths and the weaknesses of the courses they're taking, they're going to take those skills into their careers and in their lives in general. So now that I've told you why we undertook the study, I'll describe how we did it. We focused our survey on universities across Canada, and the survey was translated into French so that it could be responded to by francophones in Quebec or elsewhere. Incidentally, we had 10 respondents who completed the survey in French. And we confined it to departments of sociology or those which housed sociology. We created the sampling frame out of email addresses listed on department websites. These lists included contingent or contract faculty, although we knew those lists would be incomplete or not up to date. And then using Qualtrics program, we emailed the survey to just under 1,200 instructors in August 2019, and we kept it open for 1 month. And we had a response rate of 26.4%. And then after deleting those who didn't complete the whole survey, the final sample size was 288. So let's look a little bit at some of the sample characteristics. A couple of interesting things to note. So just over 18% of the sample were contingent or contract faculty. Now that's much lower than the figure reported recently by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in 2018 in a report called Contract U. They find that it's up around 53%. So this underrepresentation of contract faculty in our sample undoubtedly has to do with the limitations of using department websites to obtain the sampling frame. Regarding age, almost 2/3 of our respondents were in the 41 to 59 age range. There were more women than men, about 57% of the sample were women, and there were 15 non-binary gender respondents. 15% of the sample were members of racialized groups. And if we consider that in relation to the figure of 21% for university faculty overall, which was reported by the CAUT in 2018, then we have an underrepresentation of racialized groups in our sample. By the way, 21% is also the figure for the labor force as a whole. We had 6 Indigenous respondents, and we aggregated them together with other respondents in what we call racialized groups. Concerning the questions in the survey, what the survey actually looked like, most of them were closed-ended items, and most of the core questions were of the scaled type. There were 2 main open-ended questions. One of them asked people to share what was their most memorable or impactful qualitative comments that they had received on sets in the past. And we had 122 people answering that question. The other main open-ended question, we asked respondents to share anything else about student evaluations of teaching that we had not asked about. And we had 152 people responding to that. And those responses were open-coded using NVivo and analyzed in that way. So our survey questions and the hypothesis that we generated correspond to 4 main overarching research questions. So I'll address the first 3 of these questions one by one, and I'm going to incorporate the 4th one on identity characteristics in connection with the other 3. So to what extent are faculty in Canadian sociology departments receiving pedagogically irrelevant, hostile and harassing comments, and perhaps even comments that make them feel unsafe? So informing the first, it's kind of a compound question. So informing the concern about the pedagogical relevance of the comments is that the ostensible purpose of sets is to signal to us as instructors what we're doing well or not so well and how we can improve. Now, in terms of the literature, as I mentioned, there's very little systematic study of the open-ended comments and sets. But recent scholarship on the scores of sets show that the ratings are influenced by things like what was the weather like on the day the survey was done, or whether the instructor handed out delicious items before the survey was delivered. And also the compelling research that I mentioned earlier on identity-based bias in the set scores, especially along the lines of gender and racialization, is also germane to this issue, because with women and racial or ethnic minorities receiving lower scores than others, then clearly there's something else being reacted to other than teaching quality. And so the survey item that we used to get at this was a question asking the extent to which sets comments that respondents receive were a reflection of things unrelated to pedagogy. And the things that we asked people about were grade expectations, the size of the class, instructor attractiveness, gender, being a member of a racialized group, age, and perceived language proficiency or perceived accent. And so as you can see here in figure 6, an overwhelming majority of our respondents reported that yes, their sets comments reflect criteria that have nothing to do with pedagogy. And the percentages range from the 70s to the 90s, depending on the specific non-pedagogical criteria that we're looking at, that we put to them. As you can see, these largely have to do with ascribed characteristics of the instructors themselves. In figure 7, you can see that for most of these non-pedagogical criteria, the percentage is higher for women than for men, and also higher for LGBTQ respondents. We found that the differences between racialized and non-racialized faculty were not large, but it's important to keep in mind that the percentage is quite high across the board. The percentages are quite high across the board. I want to say something about what our qualitative findings were on this item. So the open-ended questions in our survey reveal that even the positive comments that instructors receive were also pedagogically not very relevant. They hovered around things like nice and best and favorite, And they were also full of gender bias, with terms like nice and caring versus brilliant aligning with the gender stereotypes. And in this respect, the results also show how the combination of age and gender can be the focus of discriminatory feedback that actually punishes women for mastery of their material. So one respondent in her late 50s observed, she said, it was worse when I was teaching courses that they didn't like, such as statistics or theory. And even when I was knowledgeable, one student felt like since I knew so much, it was time for me to retire. These responses also reflect discrimination toward both older and younger faculty, depending on the category of assessment. So we found these experiences were being reported primarily by women, and they were intertwined with sexist remarks. An illustrative example of this is a woman named Jordan, 45 years old, she's a self-described youngish woman of color, and she says she regularly receives comments about her wardrobe and personal style. And we think this reveals certain liberties that students take to evaluate young women on their looks and their presentation of self. And then we had Claudette and Gloria reporting increasingly negative and ageist comments in their sets over their teaching careers. So Gloria says, I'm still the same teacher I was, but as I've aged, and there's no chili peppers for me on my ratemyprof.com anymore, my evaluations have gone downhill. I've also noticed that comments often reflect my failure to be maternal towards my students, and that this expectation, my failure to do so, has increased as I've aged. Still on the first of these three overarching questions, which is, again, I said, really a compound question. So it's already bad news that SET's comments are being experienced as largely unhelpful to improving people's pedagogy. But what about comments that veer into hostile, harassing, or abusive terrain? So informing this question was a growing number of anecdotal published accounts over the past decade or so of a deterioration in the civility and the constructiveness of SET's comments, and a turn toward troll-like content in the comments. And these accounts suggest that it's a worsening problem, thanks largely to the digitization of the survey instrument, although other factors are argued to play a role. And I think it's because of these growing concerns that there was a large-scale systematic study of the comments done in Australia by the National Tertiary Education Union in 2017. And that's the only study we know of its kind, which focuses on faculty's reports of the comments they receive. And their study finds that 60% of the respondents receive abusive comments, and that these focus on things like appearance, religion, culture, sexuality, disability, and perceived English language ability. And they found that these were unequally distributed across particular identity groups. So they were much higher for women and higher for non-binary, gendered, and other sexual minorities, and for those born outside Australia, and for those who are racialized. So the survey item that we used for this is what you can see here in figure 5. We found that a majority of our respondents, 61%, received such comments. And this is pretty much identical to what they found in the Australian survey. In terms of how these correlate with key identity traits, the percentages are higher for women than men, they're higher for racialized respondents, and they're higher for LGBTQ respondents. They're also higher for the older group of our respondents. Now, we didn't produce a graphic for this, but of those 61% of respondents who received hostile, abusive, or bullying comments, 27% indicated that the comments have made them feel unsafe. And that also varies strikingly by whether someone is in a racialized group, with 44% of those respondents versus 23% of the non-racialized respondents being made to feel unsafe. Next, our second major overarching question: what is the impact of this on emotional well-being and morale? And might it be the case that the comments could be so demoralizing that they make people feel like exiting the field? In terms of what was driving this from within the literature, well, there's very little literature actually on the mental health of university instructors, but we had a hunch about this. And the Australian study that I mentioned did look into this issue, which bolstered our belief that this was an appropriate thing to look at. So they found that of the instructors who received abusive comments, 70% of those experienced negative emotions, and a sizable minorities of those experienced physical stress symptoms like disturbances of sleep and appetite. And also they found that the negative emotional impact of SETS comments do cause a sizable minority of faculty to wish that they could leave teaching. So they found about a third of them expressed that they had sometimes thought about leaving academe. So how did we try to get at this in our survey? We had more than one item on this. One of the items was a general question about emotional impact, as you can see here in figure 3. So we found about 1/3 overall said yes to this question. And again, it's strikingly higher for women and also for racialized faculty, which is what one would expect from respondents who are getting more of those abusive and bullying comments. We also examined intersectionality here, and we didn't produce a graphic on this, but respondents who identified with 2 or more equity-seeking groups much more often said that the qualitative comments have had a negative impact on their sense of well-being, fully 41% of those people. For those who identified with one equity-seeking group, it was 38%, and for those who identified with no equity-seeking group, it was 21%. And then we also asked more specifically a question about anxiety. On this item, a much higher percentage of the overall sample answered affirmatively. And it's considerably higher for women and for LGBTQ respondents, and also for younger respondents. And again, here, when we look at the intersectional effects, we see that 67% of those who identified with 2 or more equity-seeking groups answered yes to this. And for those who identified with one designated group, it was 65%. For those who didn't belong to any equity-seeking group, it was 46%. So quite a big difference there when we look at intersectional effects. We did also ask people if they ever considered leaving academe because of negative SETS comments. And we saw that 16% answered affirmatively, and that we found that there were no meaningful differences among the sociodemographic subgroups. But when we aggregate those who identify with 2 or more equity-seeking groups, the percentage rises to 26% from 16%. And then when we look at contingent faculty, it rises to 33%. We also asked about the impact of SETS comments on morale related to teaching. And we found that overall, only 1/5 to just under 1/3 of respondents indicated that qualitative comments on their SETS increased their self-esteem or their self-confidence. And there were no meaningful differences to report among the sociodemographic groups. Turning to the third overarching question, this concerns the impact of SETS comments on pedagogy. And here, the scholarship on the scores of SETS and the effect of the scores on pedagogy made us want to see whether there might be a parallel in the comments. So with the numerical ratings on SETS, as I sort of alluded, there's compelling evidence that they've actually had a perverse effect on learning. We know that as universities have grown to rely more and more on SETS scores since the 1970s for summative evaluation, there's been a grade inflation, which we can see in the fact that students are getting higher GPAs and higher grade averages commensurate with less hours of study. And that's been happening over the past 30 years or so. And as well, there are studies showing that SETS scores vary proportionately with the grades that students expect based on the grades they've already received in the course. There's another set of studies showing that instructors are aware that making a course easier or grading more leniently leads to better SETS scores and that they tailor their courses accordingly. So we wanted to know whether maybe it could be the case that faculty are avoiding innovation in their courses or making the courses easier in order to preempt or avoid hostile, unconstructive, negative feedback. So figure 12 shows that the percentage of our respondents who curb innovation and reduce the difficulty levels in their courses was about 40% overall. That's less than the majority, certainly, but it's substantial nonetheless. And it's not what you would expect to see, given the ostensible purpose of obtaining SETS comments. And here there are some noteworthy differences by demographic subgroup. So the percentage of women who avoided innovation and reduced the amount of material and reduced the difficulty level were considerably higher than for men. Figure 14 shows there's a correlation with being a member of a racialized group. So 49% of the racialized respondents reduced the amount of material, 46% reduced the difficulty level, compared to 40 and 39% of their non-racialized peers. And there was also a difference by age. So considerably more of those aged 40 and under avoided innovation and reduced the amount of material and reduced the difficulty level compared to those in the higher, in the older age group. So on this question of the impact on pedagogy, there's an interesting contradiction in some of the results. So some of the items show that only a minority of the respondents regards SET's comments as any kind of useful signpost or guide for their teaching. For example, only 1/3 of the overall sample believe that SET's comments are an effective means of determining teaching effectiveness. And fully 38% believe that SET's comments have led to eroding academic standards. And yet almost 2/3 reported that SET's comments are helpful in improving course design. So we could only speculate on why that is the case. We think it might be the faculty are defining improvement as preempting abusive feedback in order to achieve better SETs in the future, both better SET scores and better SETs comments. And in our qualitative results on this set of questions, we saw that respondents struggled to make sense of feedback that was polarized and contradictory. And they also reported that innovations they had invested greatly in were rejected in the comments as having no pedagogic value. And some reported finding outright dishonesty in the comments. This is an illustrative remark along those lines. The person says, I regularly have students lying, saying that I only read verbatim from the slides and that I don't give them instructions. Now, we wanted to be able to comment on the experiences of contingent faculty, what experiences they have with SET's comments. And unfortunately, there's very little systematic research on this, but a number of anecdotal essays have been published that point to very disturbing uses and effects of SET's comments and scores for contract faculty. And here I also do want to flag a forthcoming in-depth study of this. It's the only one we know of by Sandra Smeal and Andrea Quinlan, who have done an interview-based study of contract employed women at One Ontario University to look at their experience with SETs. And we cite their report in our study. So I mentioned already the percentage of respondents in our study who were contingent. So 52 of the 288 respondents were contingent. Now, for most of the survey items, they actually didn't differentiate that much from the rest of the sample, but they did for a couple of important items. So fully 74% of the contingent instructors reported having received SETs comments that they perceive as hostile, abusive, or bullying, in comparison to 58% of tenure track faculty or tenured. And of those, 41% reported feeling unsafe as a result of receiving such comments, in comparison to 24% of tenured or tenure track faculty. So to wrap up these findings, and then I'll talk about the recommendations. Our study shows that there's a considerable proportion, about 2/3 of people employed in sociology departments across Canada, who receive hostile and bullying comments, and that this is exacerbated in several major equity-seeking groups. As well, we see considerable negative well-being impacts, which again correspond with ascribed traits of the instructors. Concerning the pedagogical impact, the findings show a marked incongruence between what SETs comments are ostensibly designed to do and what they actually do. Now, there are different kinds of studies, differently designed studies, which they try to nail down the exact frequency of hostile and bullying comments in a particular large batch of SETs comments. And then they decide whether it attains some threshold level of problematic comments that we should be concerned about. Those kinds of studies tend to conclude that, in fact, there's no real problem with the SETs comments. Now, apart from some methodological problems in those kinds of studies, we actually consider that to be a kind of pointless exercise. And I say that partly because our open-ended responses show that hostile comments are actually more impactful and more memorable than the positive comments. This remark from one of our respondents is very typical and very illustrative of what we found on the open-ended items in our survey. The person said, the semester that I had students complaining about my asthma-related coughing and others complaining about my apologies for coughing, that was the semester that my attention to sets began to wane significantly. I find that there's little of value and much that has the potential to hurt and disappoint that comes from giving hundreds of people an anonymous platform to say anything they want about me with impunity. I feel this way despite the fact that overall, I get largely positive reviews. The negative comments are the ones that stick with you. So now turning to the recommendations. We'll start with recommendation 1. So on this one, we actually concur with several other recent critiques of sets overall, including a report done by Okufa in 2019, that sets comments should only be for formative and not summative purposes. And here I want to say that we think there needs to be more attention to how the comments in sets, and not just the scores, are processed in semester end evaluations. The comments matter. Myself, having served on tenure and promotion committees a number of times over my career, I can tell you that people do notice and comment on negative student feedback when they're assessing an instructor's performance. And it can influence merit ranking and renewal and so on. And yet there's so much about the comments that can't be known, the context of those comments that can't be known to a committee that's reviewing the materials. The second and third recommendations are really corollaries of the first one. If we have a shift to formative purposing of student feedback, that requires that instructors engage in an ongoing teaching and learning relationship with the students in their courses throughout the semester. And then faculty can use that to demonstrate to their colleagues that they have been doing this, and they can show what insights that they've gleaned from that. Our fourth recommendation, students should be given guidance and instruction about how their comments are used. I want to mention that Okufa argues something interesting here, that there's kind of a research ethics aspect to be considered. When we think about sets scores and sets comments as a form of data being collected, which it actually is, if it's not being fully explained to students how the data will be used, then they're not able to really give informed consent about that. As well, there's data to show that when it is carefully explained to students why and how their feedback is utilized and how their own biases may affect that, and also how the recipients of comments that are inappropriate and hurtful will be affected by that, it's found that students give more respectful and constructive criticism than they do without that kind of intervention. The fifth recommendation, supplementary forms of evaluation. Well, here especially we have in mind peer observation. And here I want to commend my own university for offering that option this year through a letter of understanding with the Faculty Association. So people are allowed to substitute out sets with peer observation of their teaching on a go-forward basis. And the sixth one, getting rid of sets altogether for contingent faculty. Well, we would love to hear from contingent faculty on this point. We think that they would benefit as much as tenured track and tenured faculty from a transition to formative purposing of sets comments. And furthermore, there's just too many ways that poor sets can hurt contingent faculty, whereas they do not stand to benefit in anything close to the same way as their tenured colleagues from getting excellent ratings. Now, times are changing, we know this. The ground is shifting in a lot of ways. And we should acknowledge a couple of recent events that may already be driving changes in how universities are doing sets, which may be opening opportunities for change that's long overdue. And one of those events is the June 2018 Ryerson arbitration that I mentioned earlier. Now, many people predicted ripple effects from that ruling across North America, and there have indeed been changes in some universities. I mentioned my own university in this regard, but we know no overview study of how much this kind of change is happening. We just don't know. And I think such a study is quite urgently needed. From having spoken to a few colleagues at various universities last year, I suspect that the willingness to change sets is uneven across institutions. And secondly, COVID-19. So the pandemic is likely to change the weight that's assigned to sets, and even whether sets are implemented at all, certainly in the short term. It's not clear how that will settle out in the medium and long term. At least to me, it's not clear, but some people participating in the webinar might have some informed predictions that they want to share with us at the end. These shifts, I think, create an opportunity for fuller change in how open-ended feedback from students is sought and how it's used. And I want to reiterate again that while there's been considerable attention to changing how we handle the numerical ratings of teaching, we must not neglect the qualitative comments. So I'll finish by thanking the CSA for providing most of the funding for the research, as well as OCUFA for its generous contribution. I also want to thank Sherry Fox, the CSA's executive director, for her invaluable support to us throughout the project. And a huge thanks to you, Rochelle Côté, for moderating, and also for your very helpful input into the study design some months back. Thank you. And I'm very anxious to hear the kinds of comments and questions that we'll have.
Thank you, Lisa. I can't say enough good things about the report. I know how much energy and time you and your colleagues, Rochelle and Rachel, have put into the study and also the production of this report. And I think you should all be really, really proud of yourselves. And so I'll leave it at that and go to the next part of this webinar, which is taking questions from the floor and seeing what everybody else has to say and what they're a little curious about. Just by way of housekeeping, everyone, I'd just like to remind you that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and that's how we'll be taking them for this webinar right now. The other thing I just wanted to mention, in case you haven't noticed, if you look up to the top left-hand corner of your screen, you'll notice that we are recording this webinar. So if you have to leave early, or if you are possibly looking to go back and revisit the talk and the questions from today, you'll have that opportunity to do so. The CSA will be posting this on their website. Lisa, oh, there we go. So I had some questions prepared, but I think what I'll do is I will just sort of go in and have a look at what our audience is wanting to ask, and I will save my questions for Lisa for a little bit later. And so Judy Chandler, she was first off the block to ask a question, but I think she had to go. She had a bit of a meeting that she had to attend. And her question to you, and I'll start with this one. For faculty who got lower ratings for the faculty member who got lower ratings due to her age, who no longer showed care about her students, is in quotations, might this also be an indicator that she might want to re-energize her teaching practice, introducing new methodology? I've worked with faculty who refused to improve their practice over years. So we'll start with that one, and we'll see what you have to say, and then we'll carry on.
Sure. I'm trying to find that comment. Like what just happened now, a bit of internet stability. I'm not sure I fully heard the question.
Oh, okay. I can repeat it for you if you want.
Yeah, and I'm trying to find it in the chat list, but I don't seem to see it. I don't seem to see that person's comment.
No, open the question and answer.
No, I see it. Faculty who got lower ratings due to her age might now be an indicator that she might want to re-energize her teaching practice. Oh, faculty refused to improve their teaching practice over the years. That's a really interesting comment. I'm sure it could be the case that there are faculty, both young and old, who are perhaps less energetic than we want them to be about their teaching. Maybe I'm naive, but I tend to assume that across all the age ranges, just from people I know in my department and elsewhere, people take enormous pride in their teaching, and they do all that they can within their time availability to energize. I think it's always a good idea for any of us to consult with experts on teaching to overhaul our design, and so on, and also to be able to narrate that in what we say to people evaluating us. So in our teaching dossiers and so on, we want to demonstrate these are the things I did. I consulted. Went to the redesign institute and so on. But I tend not to share the belief that older faculty are less energized and less energetic. Maybe I'm saying that because I'm getting there myself. I feel like I'm constantly learning about teaching and constantly open to improving it. I can't really see that any difference in some faculty who are colleagues that are older than myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. So we'll go to the next question from Dean Ray. And Dean Ray says, when I was a student at both McMaster and York University, we had focus groups with the T&P committee member after they had completed teaching observation as part of the tenure process for faculty members. And I think that this is something that a number of universities do here in Canada, at least. In both instances, the focus group session was transcribed and combined with the observations to create a report-like document. Is there any evidence that alternative qualitative practices like this might be superior, or how widespread these alternative practices might be?
Thanks, Dean, for that question. Nice. I'm really pleased that you're participating in this. So I think that we actually need to see more research on what happens with alternative methods of teaching evaluation. So how does it affect teaching when we have peer observation? How does it affect teaching when we have students being given lots of good advice about the meaning of what they're doing? I don't think we have enough research on that, and I think we really do need that kind of research. So I can't say for sure, I can't say that there's evidence that shows that it's certainly superior or not, but I think that we need alternatives to what's being done right now. And I think that instructors who do that kind of process that you're describing should be proud of that and should also narrate that in what they report about their teaching.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Lisa. I have another one here from Paris Garamone. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and I apologize if I have misstepped there. So Paris's comment, I'm very encouraged by this study. I'm wondering what might be suggested for contract faculty to replace the SETs within the teaching dossier.
So thank you for that question, Paris. My sense is that contract faculty would benefit as much as they would stand to benefit from making sets comments and set scores formative instead of summative. I think there's too much evidence that that contingent faculty can be hurt by negative scores and a few even outlier negative comments. How exactly this would work and what exactly it should look like is a question that's very important. Our set of recommendations is a step towards fully working this out, but I would really like to see work with contingent faculty, working together with tenured and tenure track faculty to devise a system that's actually better for them. And it needs to have their voices and their experiences. And there are people who are working on this as a research topic. I mentioned the study by Smeal and Quinlan. I hope that this is sort of opening the door in that direction, and that we can work this out, work on something that actually provides something that will be much more useful and would be, evidence of ways in which people work on improving their teaching without bringing in scores and summative scores and summative comments.
Great, thank you. Sonia Buffone, there are a couple other people who are interested in answers to this question, so I'm going to just sort of bring this one forward. Sonia says, I'm wondering what your thoughts are regarding the idea that qualitative comments offer some context to the quantitative numbers on course evals. In this sense, if an inappropriate comment were to be made and this corresponded to a low eval score, we would have good justification to drop the entire course eval from the instructor's ratings. Without the qualitative comments, it can be hard to make sense of the numbers. I feel we are missing some context that could help.
If an inappropriate thank you, Sonia, for that question. if an inappropriate comment were made, and this corresponds to a low evaluation score, we would have good justification to drop the entire course eval. That may be the case, but I also want to put out there the possibility that comments, instead of providing context, may actually be missing context. So it could be possible that comments that faculty are getting in their evaluations are actually, they're not able to show, well, what was happening in that course. Like, apart from the size of the course and so on, could it be that the topic the person was teaching on was kind of considered too controversial or challenging for the students? There are also sometimes cases in which the faculty member may be dealing with situations of, well, frankly, contra-power bullying or harassment in the classroom and in social media settings. So I think sometimes when we look at the comments, we're missing that kind of context. So you may be right, but I also think that comments themselves need to be contextualized.
Great. And this one from Matt Strang. Could you comment more on themes emerging with LGBTQ instructors and faculty?
Thank you, Matt, for that question. I wish I could, but our question, our survey has like really just, just slightly delved into how there's correlation between the items that we're interested in and whether someone is heterosexual or LGBTQ. And I think that the literature on this is actually also a bit contradictory. So some of the literature that we cite in our report shows that that there are cases in which LGBTQ faculty are sometimes getting more negative scores, or sometimes that there's no difference. I should also say that in our open-ended feedback, we also found kind of a mix of things. We found some faculty were kind of being seemingly condemned for being openly gay, and others were considered sort of heroic for being openly gay in their teaching. So I feel like the literature and also our open-ended results are showing some contradictions on this, and I think that further kind of more fine-tuned research is needed to really understand how that is playing out.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Over to Karen Stambridge, my colleague here at Memorial University, who's just sort of down the road from me. She writes, "Excellent report, Lisa. Kudos to you and your colleagues. I'm wondering, given what you've learned from faculty members, do you have any recommendations for instructors around the kinds of evaluations that they might implement themselves? Perhaps one at the beginning of the term, then others throughout." And this is similar to the question that was just asked.
Hi, Karen, and thanks for the question. So I think that there's all kinds of interesting possibilities with soliciting formative feedback. And I think that the comments matter more than scores. I think it is possible to use a rating system throughout the semester, and it could be at the beginning and at the end. And I think that also at different points throughout the semester, depending on what is the aspect of the course design or the assignment that the instructor wants to find out about. So I think that I think for our own development, our own formative development, it's a really good idea to do that. And then also for how we demonstrate that to our peers evaluating us, to show that we did that and to indicate what were the insights that came out of that. I think it's a really good idea. And I think how the questions are worded depends very much on the specific course. And so giving faculty members control over that, over the actual writing of the questions, is extremely important, as well as giving them judgment over the timing of when to do that.
Great, thank you. We have a question from an anonymous attendee, and just quickly, thank you so much for taking the time to ask your question, even though you don't feel comfortable with giving your name. I'd like to encourage other attendees for the webinar that if you too are uncomfortable with providing your name, you are more than welcome to do a similar thing and just post yourselves as an anonymous attendee. So this question from Anonymous, thank you for your presentation. Can you speak more about how racism can affect the way a student approaches the SETs? So some examples could be accents, different teaching styles based on international training, Black, Indigenous, people of color course content, and how this is considered or not by tenure and promotion committees.
How racism can affect the way a student approaches SETs. Well, thank you also, yes, for your question about this. Just thinking, if you don't mind, I'm just kind of processing the question a little bit.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the literature is pretty unequivocal about how racism among students, reflecting racism in the broader society, plays out in SET scores. There's study after study, especially over the past decade or so, that make it practically incontestable that there's a serious problem in how racial minorities, racialized groups are being evaluated and their scores being lower. So then what about the T&P committees? So if the process is done well, and maybe I'm naive in suspecting in saying that at least certain minimums will be cleared in this process. I can certainly say that for my own university, that we're required to do anti-bias training before we take part in the T&P process. So once we're on the committee, we're required to do anti-bias training, which requires us to think about exactly all these things. So I would hope that that minimum bar is cleared across various institutions. Do I know for a fact? I don't. Would be good to maybe have research that looks into this, but that's how I would answer that. And thank you for the question.
As far as I know, my university does not require that we take any type of diversity or cultural sensitivity training before being on a P&T committee. So, I mean, that sounds like a great idea, though, and I commend your university for doing that.
Me too.
Next question from Perpetua Matui, and again, I apologize if I got the name wrong. So Perpetua says, "Thank you very much for the work. I find it unfortunate that this practice has been ongoing since the 1970s, and not much study has been done, yet the impact is real and especially negative for equity-seeking groups. Are there resource websites where alternative forms of feedback exist?"
I love that question. Thank you very much for that question, Perpetua. So I don't know if there are websites which exist. However, what I will say is that I've been really impressed by research by an American expert on post-secondary education, which looks into incorporating students as peer reviewers, but in a different way than conventionally done. So where students who are not taking the course being evaluated are actually paid and trained up to do objective observation of what's going on in the course. I think her work is a great resource to consult about this. I'm not aware of a website. Maybe others participating will know of such a resource. And if it doesn't exist, it may be time to put one together that could be particularly useful for the Canadian context.
Maybe that's something that we could encourage participants to do, that if they do know of alternative websites that provide other methods of evaluation, they can feel free to either post them in the chat box or in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that that they're published as a part of the webinar transcripts.
Yeah,
great.
Thanks.
Okay, another question from Anonymous. I'm assuming it's a different Anonymous this time, however. So Anonymous says, "Hello, great talk. I'm curious about what guidance can be provided to P&T committees and deans regarding SETs. Some seem to think that those who get below average scores are poor teachers, but an average is an average, it's not a standard. Are there any universities that set targets or standards rather than pit faculty against each other through the use of averages?" And that's just about the numeric scores. The broader issue is, what are better ways to assess quality, like peer reviews, etc., which you have begun to address?
Thank you, anonymous attendee. So two things I want to say about this. One is I think we actually need a study. we need to see what's going on in universities post Ryerson ruling, to see whether what kinds of changes are happening, especially with the treatment of scores and the comments. And I can say that, again, I have to give kudos to my own university. You know, the instruction is to not compare averages of scores across across faculty. That the only scores that are relevant is comparing the professor to him or herself, to compare them to themselves, I should say, and not to look at averages of those numbers. Especially when you consider the absurdity of the questions being asked, like how stimulating was the person, and you know, how much did they, I don't know, other sorts of questions of that type. So I suspect we're not the only university that's doing that, but I think it's really important to look at what is being done across the country and across North America, actually.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So I'm going to take my chair privilege a little bit, Lisa. And
Okay.
I know I have a question for you that I've been kind of thinking about. And so, you know, throughout this webinar and some of the questions from the audience as well, you know, people have been wanting to know, well, you know, what are some of the takeaways for, you know, faculty members and lecturers and the people who are actually doing the teaching? And then we had another question that asks about what university administration and P&T committees can do with this and all, and with the findings of your report. I mean, one of the things that we don't typically think about, or that we might not be thinking about, are some of the ways in which this report might be beneficial to students going forward. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to, you know, what you think might be helpful for students to take away from your findings and from the report in general.
Well, I think I did mention earlier, I think that students can only benefit from a kind of long overdue overhaul of how we purpose and process the SETS comments. I think that doing so is not going to put an end to negative feedback on courses, not at all. I think that, in fact, we're likely to get negative but constructive feedback on courses, and that can only be helpful to students. I also think that for too long, university administrations, for the most part, have kind of neglected a duty they have to advise students about what all of this means. So we're faced with a kind of like social media trolling culture outside academia, but the boundaries are very permeable. So this stuff finds its way into the private sites, like the unofficial Rate My Prof type sites, and it, I think, leads into the official evaluations as well. And so, you know, students are going to be facing these kinds of things themselves one day in one form or another. They're going to find themselves rated like a Amazon product. So I think that if, you know, for them to obtain the skills in doing this, it will help them to actually give a meaningful and instructive, constructive feedback. And it will rebound in better teaching, because it will liberate faculty to, you know, dedicate their energies without being afraid that they fall on their face if they do an innovation that doesn't go over well. Sometimes we're seeing in our results that people refrain from innovation because they're worried about negative feedback. But if we could liberate those energies, you know, if faculty could do that more freely, and seek students' feedback throughout the course with a real relationship with students throughout the course, instead of leaving it all to the end, to have some like overall assessment where you get problems like the halo effect, which is where you have one overarching question affecting all the smaller questions as well. And I think that similar things might happen in the open-ended comments when these are semester end surveys. Yeah. I don't know if I've answered the question adequately, but I really do think it is. I feel quite passionate that it's a win-win situation for students and faculty.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Sonia actually has a bit of a follow-up question to the more general one that I asked for you. She asked if you know of any types of strategies that you can suggest to help train students about how to fill out course evals in more meaningful ways.
Thanks for the question, Sonia. I know that you work on this issue. It's really like close to you, and you're one of the experts on this. I'm going to refer to a report that we cited by UBC nurses, and it's led by Moralejo. from 2019. And she and her colleagues looked at nursing faculty. And although they only had 5 faculty members, so really small and on the faculty side, they had hundreds of students in this study. And so they ran an experiment actually, where they had a group, like they had an experimental group, which was provided feedback and guidance on what all this stuff means. And they had the other group, the control group, which did not receive that intervention. And they found an important difference between them, where the students who received the intervention were giving better feedback and constructive. They gave more negative comments actually, but they did it respectfully and constructively. So I think it would be good to like actually go to their study and even talk to them about it and see how they did that, because I think it could stand as a kind of model, or at least a good starting point to build that up and build that out.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. Well, we're going to take just one more question, I think, unless there is anybody else out there that has any burning questions that they would like to ask of Lisa. We'll keep it open for a few more minutes, and if we don't have time to answer everybody's questions, they will be answered in the transcripts once this is all published. So Karen asks another question, Karen Stanbridge, and she asks, your study focused on sociology profs, and it's been my experience that humanities and social science instructors are expected to be more entertaining than instructors in the harder sciences. It would be interesting to see how this plays out over faculties and schools.
So interesting that there may be an expectation of social science and humanities instructors to be more entertaining. That I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I know that there's a group of scholars at my own university led by Omer, and they have a forthcoming study which focuses on the feedback, open-ended feedback comments, and they compare STEM profs to social science and humanities profs. So it doesn't quite get at what you're getting at, the question of entertainment and so on. But they did find that the STEM faculty were overall kind of more satisfied with SET's comments than the non-STEM faculty. But I think it would be worth looking into, and maybe the study will go into more detail about that. Does it have to do with sort of entertainment, sort of like flame juggling aspect of what's expected? I think, I suspect my own view is probably there's an expectation that even in the STEM, there's an expectation that instructors are positive, energetic, passionate, happy. I will quickly reference, I mentioned the Okufa report from 2019. At the end of their report, there's a study by U of Waterloo professor, I think his or her name is Michela, and they talk about what exactly is reflected in high scores and sets. And the person cites research on this, and it's about personality stuff too, right? So I don't know if it will distinguish between STEM and non-STEM, but it will be interesting to look at that.
So do you see this report in this study as kind of the final word on qualitative comments and SETs, or more of a starting point?
Absolutely, we do not. I know I'm speaking for my co-researchers as well on this. We don't see it as a final word. There's 6 little recommendations. They reflect our findings. They're interwoven with what light that is shed by other literature. And we really hope for engagement with people who are studying this, people who are experts on education in sociology, but far beyond sociology. It would be terrific if they give us some viewpoints on our recommendations, the content of them, and also like how to give them legs. So how to make those impactful. So by no means are the final word. I'm hoping that that we do get that kind of engagement, and we can produce a compound document, set of recommendations based on ours, but based on what other experts are finding and thinking about this.
Yeah, for sure. I think that makes perfect sense. We're going to do one last question, and then I think we'll end it for today. Thanks so much, everybody, for your participation, your wonderful comments and questions for Lisa today. And thank you again, Lisa, for coming on and giving us this really excellent summary of what you've been doing. So I think the last comment here that we have is from Abdi, and Abdi says, I think the negative effects of SETs cannot be entirely undone given the availability of online media to students to do the same. And they have positive effects as well. So perhaps we should be thinking about supplementing them with peer evaluation and feedback, plus giving instructors more control over the questions and comments, plus instructors' decisions about what they should be used for and which parts.
Thank you so much, Abdi, for that excellent observation. So a couple of things there. I think supplementing is a great step forward. It's better than where we're at right now. Although there's always been the supplement, I think, of the teaching dossier. And nevertheless, I still think that scores and summative comments have an unwarranted impact and influence on peer assessment of your colleagues' evaluations of your teaching. I think that the reason we recommended really replacing that summative, and we concur with Akufa on this, to really get rid of the summative scores and comments, is because they still have that impact. I feel like even with various trainings and guidance and so on to T&P committees, I think there's still always that kind of hazard. And I also think that with formative feedback, it won't rule out, like you're saying, absolutely. It's not going to rule out that there may be kind of racially biased and even overtly same professional consequence. It's not going to have the same consequences for renewal, tenure, and promotion, and so on. That's what I would say to that. I know the social media is always out there. It's always, what are we going to do about the fact that every time people teach courses, there's a Facebook version of your Facebook page for your course where people can say whatever they want with impunity. I don't know how to deal with that particular issue, but I feel like the administration can step up to its duty of making students understand how important this is to be constructive and respectful.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you so much. I'd just like to call everybody's attention to the screen where it gives you the web address to be able to download the report that Lisa, Rochelle, and Rachel worked so hard on. If you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to contact Sherry at the CSA office, or just visit the CSA website more generally. And again, just check back on the CSA website for a copy of this webinar along with the transcripts, which should be made available just as soon as Sherry is able to get that done. So thank you, everybody. It's been a true pleasure, Lisa, having a bit of a chat with you and also listening to, or I guess looking at all of the comments and feedback that people had today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your comments and your participation. I'm really grateful and pleased. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.